Hi, this is Fuentedura. Over the past few podcasts, we've seen what a video game is, what makes for a good video game. We've also seen the different genres of video games, and finally we've looked at research in both learning and education in the context of video games. So now we're ready to pull this all together in terms of a systematic strategy for the use of video games in the classroom. And the strategy is called critical gaming. There are several different approaches to critical gaming, but the essentials of all of them look pretty much the same. First thing you have to do is make some decisions as to what it is you want to do with video games in the classroom. And I've outlined here 6 major areas. Are you looking to provide domain-specific content? In other words, if you're teaching history, are you trying to teach something very specific about a specific series of events during the American Revolution? Are you looking to provide domain-specific analytic and problem-solving approaches? This is more along the lines of, are you trying to get students to think like historians? Are you looking to enhance skill transfer to related tasks or domains? In other words, are you looking, say, to have a game that plays out in history primarily, but you're looking to enhance the skill transfer to, for instance, sociological thinking by your students? Are you looking to enhance general skills or cognitive processes? In other words, here you want to think about puzzle games or twitch games that enhance skills are not particularly tied to a specific content area, but rather are general thinking skills or general reaction to certain types of situation skills by your students. Are you looking to develop specific social structures? You may have, for instance, a scenario where you want your students to work in teams with a given structure on the research of a problem. Again, let's say in history. Well, do you want to use a video game to develop those social structures, to develop that team structure that then will carry over into the historical research arena? And finally, do you just want to improve participant motivation? In other words, are you trying to take students in your class and make them more satisfied about what they're learning in the class, happier with the class, happier about the work they're doing in general? Now, I wish I could say that you're going to be able to find tons and tons of educational games ready for the picking for any of these arenas in any content area you might be interested in. The fact of the matter is that that's a very unlikely scenario. So more often than not, what you'll be looking at is at using a commercial game that was developed primarily for entertainment purposes and only secondarily for educational purposes in your classroom. When you're looking at commercial games, you have to go back to the research that we looked at last time, and you find the following. If you're looking to provide domain-specific content, you find that so far this is a weak arena. In other words, there are very few commercial games that are solid in this regard. However, if you're looking at providing domain-specific analytic and problem-solving approaches, that's a bit different. And this works well. So for instance, you could be looking at using, say, Civilization or Europa Universalis in a history classroom, but this approach that we're talking about here, called critical gaming, is essential to getting good mileage out of these games. If you're looking at enhancing skill transfer to related tasks or domains, this also is an okay to strong arena, although in many cases you won't be looking at, say, whatever is the central topic of the game, but rather at skills developed by students in the process of playing the game. A perfect example of this is real-time strategy games, where you're looking at students developing very strong skills in terms of rapid decision making about allocation of resources, but not necessarily in the central topic of the real-time strategy game, which might be a restaurant simulation, for instance. When you're looking at enhancing general skills or cognitive processes, this is also an arena where commercial games are okay or very strong, but you need to look at the research carefully. In other words, I've mentioned already in previous podcasts the research that's been done in games like Tetris and the research that's been done in games like chess. But don't assume that every puzzle game that sort of looks like Tetris will have the same effects, and don't assume that every board game that is sort of chess-like will have the same effects. You need to go to the literature and research and see what the information is that is out there. Developing specific social structures tends to be very weak. In other words, just because students play as a good team in, say, World of Warcraft, that doesn't mean they'll play as a good team in your management or history research class. So this is not a recommended use for commercial games. And finally, for improving participant motivation, while it is true that you can say, well, here's a game, isn't this fun? If you look at the research, students tend to view this as a distraction from the class. So it's not as simple as saying, well, we did a lot of boring work, now you can go and play a fun game. Students may actually find this doubly punitive. First, they find it punitive that you're doing boring work to begin with. And secondly, they find it punitive that the only thing that can be developed in terms of alleviating the boredom is, well, now go and play a game for no very good apparent reason. So this can actually backfire on you rather badly. Again, this is not the use I recommend of commercial games in the classroom. Now, we also looked at genres, and we said different genres had different advantages in terms of their use in the classroom. And particularly interesting categories are interactive fiction, and especially if you're looking at topics such as structure analysis for storytelling. We'll come back to this in a later podcast. Also, role-playing games are very useful in the classroom. So for instance, if you're looking at a theater class, role-playing games allow you to study what those dramatic structures look like. MMOGs, as I mentioned before, are not particularly good in terms of team building, but do have strong aspects in terms of their use for narrative studies in the classroom. Alternate reality games also have strong uses in this regard. Sims can be used both in terms of system modeling, but also to be used as metagames to be studied via statistical and research techniques. Real-time strategy games, I already mentioned, have very strong components in terms of developing decision skills, but can also be applied in modeling aspects. World strategy games are very good for developing how would a historian look at a situation, or how would you question historical assumptions types of skills. And finally, Twitch games can be used to develop intuitive spatial knowledge of areas that might not be accessible to students via direct physical experimentation, as well as improve dexterity skills. Again, think of the example of surgeons becoming more skilled via Twitch games in this regard. So we can summarize everything we've just said in the following diagram. On the left-hand side, you have the commercial game genres that show the most promise in their use in the classroom. We then have a branching into commercial games and educational games, in other words, games developed specifically for education. And if we look at using commercial games via the approach we're about to outline, which is critical gaming, we have three major areas that are worthwhile looking at, while educational games, if properly designed and in many cases either instructor created or student created, have the capacity to tackle all six of the arenas that we had outlined earlier. Now that we've decided what areas are worthwhile looking at in terms of uses of commercial games in education, let's turn to the actual approach taken by critical gaming. One thing you want to be asking yourself whenever you play a game in terms of critical gaming are the following four questions. The first one is, why are you doing what you're doing to beat the game? In other words, say you're playing Mario. Why are you choosing to jump in a given location and not another? The second one then is, what aspects of the game lead you to that approach? So what are the cues, both explicit and implicit, built into a game that lead you to take that particular approach to beat the game? A third question then becomes, where are you taking risks and where are you playing it safe? And notice that, of course, that relies upon the previous answer, in other words, the aspects of the game that lead you to take the approach that you answered in the first question. And the final question, which is what skills you need to develop to get better at this game. In other words, this leads you to say, well, what would I do next? Now, a student that answers these four questions in the context of critical gaming about a game they're playing is not going to answer them just once. Rather, they're going to answer them both throughout the game as they play through the game, but also in a sort of iterative loop. In other words, the answer to question number 4, the skills you need to develop to get better at this game, will change the answer they had originally given to question number 1, and the cycle continues again. And notice that these 4 questions get at all the key elements of games that we have looked at over the past few podcasts. In other words, what we're looking at is giving students the tools they need to become more aware of the internal workings of the game, what makes the game tick, and what makes their responses work in relationship to the game. So this is a way for the students to become aware of the workings of the game and aware of what it is they're getting from the game. Once you have that established as a practice by students who are playing this game in your classroom, now you're ready to go through the systematic process that's involved in critical gaming. Using these 4 questions as the basis for the approach, and with your knowledge of the topics that we've covered in the previous podcasts, what you want to set out is a path that allows your students to do the following. First, establish what the game is attempting to represent. In other words, if your students are playing Civilization, let's say, what is it that the game is trying to represent about the rise, development, and fall of civilizations? Next is establish how it's doing it. And this is going to be directly related to the answer to those 4 questions we looked at before. In other words, they will now have the material necessary to say, how is the game setting out challenges, how are they facing them, and how is this then related to the representation of the content of the game. Based upon this, determine the game's successes, but also determine the shortcomings and their sources. And we're talking here about technical limits, but we're also talking about game fun limits. Remember our discussion of that topic earlier on, as well as conceptual limits. This is where you'll be working with your students to say, for instance, well, a historian thinks about technology in these ways. Is it the same way that civilization represents technology? Or a historian would think about diplomatic relations between nations in this way. Where do we see limitations, some of which are imposed by technical aspects of the game, but some of which are imposed also by conceptual aspects of how civilization is implemented in its representation of diplomacy between civilizations. After those shortcomings have been identified, you invite your students to propose remedies for the shortcomings, and finally ways to further investigate the game. Going through this process will yield benefits for your students that are much greater than those they would derive from playing the game, shall we say, naively, and additionally will avoid some of the problems you can get into using games in the classroom. For instance, this approach will guarantee that your students don't believe that history happens just like it's outlined in Civilization or Europa Universalis, but instead will understand those games to be models of how cultures and civilizations work, with certain limitations that are very different from those that are involved in serious historical models. At this point, this may all seem rather abstract. So what I'd like to propose to you is that after listening to this podcast, you try to apply the methodology I've just described to 2 separate games. The first of these games is Portal, the Flash version. This is a puzzle game with a few elements of Twitch games in it, and it will provide you with an excellent opportunity to apply the critical gaming approach to it so that you can analyze the game, not just in terms of what we talked about in this podcast, but also what we've talked about in all the podcasts up to this point, and to give it some thought in terms of how this type of game might be used to enhance students' intuition about physical processes. In particular, how students might develop a better understanding of conservation of momentum by playing this game. The second game is Micropolis, and you will recognize it as our old friend SimCity. In fact, this is the original version of SimCity, which has been released into the public domain by its creators for educational purposes. As you play through Micropolis, in addition to all the elements we looked at before, you want to think about 2 things. First, the specific things that make Sims useful in the classroom and how they're reflected in Micropolis. And second, what the limitations of the Micropolis model are and how pointing out those limitations might prove useful to students' educational experience. All right, so that's it for this podcast. As always, here are the bibliographic resources for this podcast, as well as the sources for the 2 free games I mentioned. Next time, we'll be talking about how storytelling plays out in the world of games and how that relates to how you might use games in education. Until next time, enjoy playing the games, and I'll see you then.